can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, amazing. Great. Okay. This is a little bit botched. I'm talking through my phone, but sharing the screen through my laptop. I'm simultaneously Charlotte Ross and Charlotte Ross 2, but I hope this works.
That does appear to be working, so.
Excellent. Right, let's just go with it whilst it works. Thank you so much for rearranging this.
That's okay.
God, I love technology.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. The giant stands as a hybrid figure who straddles the liminal space between human and monster, representing the other against which the self is defined. Post-conquest European literature is notably replete with these hybrid figures. More typical is the giant encountered by Arthur on Mont Saint-Michel, a monstrous creature who rapes women, eats children, and terrorizes the countryside until he is killed by the king. However, the chansons de geste that recount legendary tales of community and collectivity engage with these marginal bodies in an intriguing way by occasionally bringing them deeper into the narrative. This paper will explore the adaptation and interpretation of the giant hero Renoir in two 12th century chansons, the Anglo-Norman Chanson de Guillaume and the Old French Aliscan. As retellings of the same epic tale, the chansons represented the dissemination or regeneration of Renoir's tale. The poems tell the legend of the French Christian Lord Guillaume and his battles against Spanish Saracens. Halfway through the narrative, he encounters the giant Renoir working in King Louis's kitchen. Renoir is a Saracen and the son of the King of Spain, who is kidnapped as a child and enslaved. Guillaume recognizes his worth as a soldier and takes him under his wing. Over the ensuing battles, Renoir learns to fight like a knight and accrues immense glory, and at the end of the poem, when the French are victorious, he is baptized, given wealth and land, marries, and becomes a knight. Renoir's assimilation into Christian society occurs at different rates in different contexts, and there is a marked difference between his integration on the battlefield and in court. The chansons feature subtle differences in their depiction of the giant's assimilation into court, and by investigating Renoir's assimilation or lack thereof into these contexts, I seek to gain a perspective on the Old French and Anglo-Norman understanding of the recuperability of the racial and monstrous other. Is that going to move? There we go. As not only a giant but a Saracen, Renoir is representative of the wider context surrounding the understanding of otherness in the 12th century. Saracen enemies in chansons are often portrayed as giants, inhabiting the two extremes of humanity and monstrous inhumanity. As a giant, Renoir represents a figure of hybridity and is by definition a malleable character. The malleability of monstrous creatures has often been exploited by authors to create characters that are perfectly adapted to the needs of the text, as Geoffrey J. Cohen explains here. The hybridity of giants in particular makes them ideally suited to this task, combining cultural and material, interior and exterior, to create figures that inhabit the gap between demarcations. I suggest that Renoir's Saracen identity is equally malleable due to the fictionalization of the Saracen in these chansons de geste. Schwan-Calkin argues that the Saracen holds an important symbolic function in establishing identities, noting that the Muslim figures who appear in medieval Western literature usually bear little or no resemblance to historical Muslims of the period. Instead, they can be understood as representations of the East produced in the West for Western consumption. Renoir's monstrosity and Saracen identity foreground particular features associated with the stereotypes of body and race, leaving him in a liminal space, which forms a component in the individualized aspects of his identity. These permit him the malleability to be assimilated into society. When Renoir is first introduced in the chanson, he initially resembles the stereotype of the young hero. Despite his monstrosity, he displays many of the well-established features of this stock character, an unrefined youth unjustly assigned to a lower social station, with hints of superhuman skill that predestine him for glory. However, whilst Renoir progresses from servant to lord throughout the chanson, he does not exhibit the courtly civilization anticipated of such a heroic figure. Whilst we expect him to be taught modesty, elegance, restraint, moderation, and respectfulness, instead Renoir's behavior undergoes no such refinement. His journey can more profitably be understood as social assimilation, following Arnold Rose's definition of the adoption by a person or group of the culture of another social group to such a complete extent that they no longer have any characteristics identifying them with their former culture. This assimilation occurs at different rates in different contexts, and Renoir's social standing on the battlefield and in court is distinctly different. Both chansons agree that Renoir fully assimilates into martial society on the battlefield. The giant integrates into Guillaume's army and is adopted by the French to the extent that he loses his Saracen characteristics. Both Chanson de Guillaume and Aliscan consistently show how Renoir's monstrosity is recognized as an advantage in war, and the giant quickly accrues honor and glory. In the midst of battle, the giant destroys the Saracens' ships to prevent them from fleeing, a tactical move that impresses the French soldiers, who declare him a wise warrior. His monstrous strength is now admired, and the Aliscan narrator even notes that the French soldiers respect him for it. Renoir further integrates into the martial chain of command by forming his own brigade. In the midst of battle, he discovers a group of soldiers fleeing the conflict and accuses them of cowardice. When they refuse to fight, in a monstrous rage he kills 14 of them and incorporates the remainder into his own troop. In a final demonstration of assimilation, the French army ride to the giant's rescue when he is nearly defeated by a Saracen. So why is Renoir, both a giant and a Saracen, permitted assimilation in this martial context? A giant's strength, size, and stamina makes him the perfect soldier, and here Renoir's monstrosity is suited to the context of warfare. Furthermore, his monstrosity makes him a suitable opponent for the monstrous Saracen enemy. On multiple occasions, Renoir delivers the final blow against the demonic knights that have defeated his French peers, and the chansons stress that he is responsible for Guillaume's victory. Conceptually, the battlefield is a place of blurred boundaries, located within the crusading context where Saracens were encountered on the threshold. Judith Walker establishes that although chansons portray Saracens as monstrous characters, they also realistically depict Saracen soldiers with the vices and virtues of ordinary humans. When they are encountered in battle, dressed in the same arms and riding the same horses, we see a recognition of their chivalry that mitigates their monstrosity. Thus, the battleground becomes a permeable space where questions of selfhood and otherness are addressed, and it is little wonder that Renoir, as a hybrid character, is permitted assimilation in this martial context. However, in the courtly context, Renoir's assimilation is more complex and less easily achieved at all, and he exists in a liminal space. The conclusions of the chanson portray Renoir's assimilation into courtly society in distinctly different ways, and they disagree on the extent of his integration. The moment the battle is won, both chansons depict the same pivotal scene. Guillaume and his army return to court to feast, but forget Renoir and lock the giant outside of the city walls. Renoir laments his condition and lists the great deeds he has done for Guillaume, concluding, "Guillaume holds me so cheap that he refuses to invite me to eat with him." Both chansons insist on the foolishness of Guillaume's error and the injustice of Renoir that Renoir suffers. In a moment of rage, the giant threatens to travel to Spain, raise an army, and return. Portrayed as a childish tantrum, the giant violently laments as he threatens the French. When Guillaume finally realizes his mistake and sends his knights to retrieve the giant, Renoir reverts to his monstrous Saracenness and pulls the ridgepole from a nearby hut to use as a makeshift club. This scene illustrates that Renoir has undergone no courtly civilization across the chanson and remains unrefined. Yet crucially, it reveals that he is still a segregated figure outside of the martial context, a move that highlights the hypocrisy of the court, who are willing to exploit his monstrosity on the battlefield but alienate him moments later. The most striking element of this scene is the unconsciousness of the portrayal. Renoir is not deliberately excluded from the court, but is apparently forgotten in a moment of blind bigotry. This perhaps speaks to the unconscious bias witnessed at the center of Christian society against those of another race. The act of feasting is a ritualized ceremony founded on the principles of community and lineage, a social space that is constructed by the hierarchies of the court. Giants are notorious for their ravenous appetites and uncivilized demeanor, and therefore Guillaume would be justified in barring Renoir from the feast. Yet the narrators of both chansons emphasize that this is not a conscious decision on Guillaume's part, and stress that it does not cross his mind to bring the giant into the courtly circle. This represents an unconscious distancing of the other from the domestic, and is emblematic of the final barrier to the giant's assimilation. Renoir's monstrosity and Saracenness are equally responsible for this exclusion, and the unconsidered nature of Guillaume's failure speaks to the impossibility of assimilating a hybrid figure into courtly society without conscious stimulus. From this point, the chansons end Renoir's tale in different ways and diverge in their portrayal of his assimilation into court. In Chanson de Guillaume, Renoir is ultimately fully integrated into courtly society. However, his admission is grudging, and it is only when his nobility is revealed that he is fully assimilated. Upon hearing Renoir's threats, Guillaume remarks that is much to be feared and offers a large sum of his inheritance to pacify the giant, a move catalyzed by the threat of his monstrosity. Renoir's eventual assimilation is enabled by Guillaume's wife, Guibourg, who begs him to forgive Guillaume's error. Upon hearing this, Renoir concedes and is presented with tokens of courtly appreciation, great wealth, 100 mules and war horses, 7 castles, a wife, and he is baptized. The trope of incorporating an uncivilized youth into court is well established in post-conquest French literature by this point. In a lost 14th century chanson, Valentine tames his twin brother Orson, who was raised by bears. Specifically, the image of the already courtly female civilizing the male appears in other literature of the period. In the Middle High German Wilhelm, which took Aliscan as its source, Guibourg teaches Renoir the courtier's behaviors of hand-washing before meals and polishing his armor. The revelation of Renoir's noble identity catalyzes his reconciliation into the court. 5 lines before the end of the poem, Guibourg declares, "Kiss me, brother, I am your true-born sister," and the poem abruptly ends with no reference to Renoir's descendants who proliferate in the Old French texts. Renoir's nobility can be credited with enabling his integration, promoting his social mobility because of his pre-existing ties with both Christians and humans through his sister Guibourg. This revelation catalyzes Renoir's synthesis into Guillaume's noble lineage and is symbolic of the giant's ultimate assimilation into courtly society. I suggest that Renoir's assimilation into Guillaume's court in Chanson de Guillaume reflects the chanson's understanding that Saracenness is recuperable when combined with nobility of birth. It is not surprising that the giant's race can be put to one side. Stephen Kruger argues that the medieval concept of race is a blend of moral character and blood that results in a double focus, whereby racial identity is at once changeable and immutable. He notes, for the Middle Ages, sexuality, race, and religion are all constructed at least partly in moral terms. This belief is concurrent with the very foundation of the chanson. As an epic poem set in the Crusades, it is based on the moral conviction that religion, and race to an extent, is recuperable. Furthermore, reflecting on the fictionalization of the Saracen, it could be said that Renoir as a character is created to be assimilated, and therefore his Saracen qualities exist to be recuperable. However, it is evident that this assimilation is only permitted because his monstrosity is ignored. Once he discards the ridgepole, descriptions of the giant's physical body are startlingly absent from the chanson. To say that the giant's monstrosity is also recuperable would be incorrect, as this suggests it is accepted by Guillaume's court or understood in a new light. Instead, Renoir's monstrosity is conveniently effaced, and the chanson ends with the image of reunited siblings. Contrastingly, the Renoir of the Old French Aliscan is never permitted full assimilation into courtly society, and remains an excluded character in a liminal space at the end of the chanson. The Old French poem places greater emphasis on Renoir's victimization, describing his anger at being forgotten and including moments of interiority to portray Guillaume's shame. As a result, Renoir is depicted as a downtrodden victim, and the audience is invited to pity his plight. As he threatens the French, Renoir reveals to Guibourg that he is her brother, an announcement that is made far earlier in Aliscan than de Guillaume. Even though this revelation leads Guillaume to physically welcome Renoir into the court, the narrator emphasizes that he remains an alienated figure. Although the giant is presented with similar gifts of land, knights, fine arms, and a wife, and he is baptized, the chanson makes it evident that he is not fully assimilated when the narrator reveals that despite the gifts, he never would forsake his kitchen stoves, his favorite warming place. Whoever tried to change him always failed, for he had learned that life and could not change. Furthermore, when invited to eat at Guillaume's table, he refrains from eating and is clearly out of place, preferring to lie down in the kitchen grate. This recalibration in Renoir's social standing reflects a shift in the audience's perception of his complicity in his own exclusion. It reveals the giant has undergone no real social progression from his youth as a kitchen servant, and thus, even at the end of Aliscan, the difference between human and monstrous remains marked. With this unique conclusion to Renoir's cycle, the Old French chanson shifts the complicity from the court onto the other, and suggests the giant is no longer forcibly ostracized, but evokes and even acknowledges his own exclusion. I suggest Renoir is not permitted full courtly assimilation in Aliscan because, whilst his Saracenness is again recuperable when combined with nobility, the Old French chanson simply cannot ignore his monstrosity. Even after his nobility is revealed, the giant's physicality remains his preeminent feature. As he is baptized, the narrator describes his great weight, and he is presented with armor that is distinctly excessive. This follows the stereotypical technique of using physical characteristics as leading indicators of a figure's assimilability. The tension between Renoir's physicality and morality is foreshadowed in his first scene, where within the space of 2 lines he is described as bloodthirsty, yet no finer youth lives in France's borders. The chanson places at its centre this conflict between the ideals of a warrior society, of virility, ferocity in battle, powerful physique, and the giant, who is an absolute form that clashes with these courtly chivalric cultures. Whilst on the battlefield, Renoir's monstrosity permits him a central role. In the courtly setting, the chansons highlight that this assimilation is more complex. Both Chanson de Guillaume and Aliscan agree that Renoir's Saracen race is recuperable when combined with nobility. The mingling of bloods between Guillaume and Guibord reveals the racial other is assimilable into lineage. However, in the courtly context of Aliscan, it is Renoir's very monstrosity that bars his integration. The difference in assimilation in the martial and courtly settings may be in part due to the different threats presented in each context. On the battlefield, the Saracen enemy poses the greatest threat, both morally to Christianity and physically to the French, a danger that Renoir is able to defeat. However, in the setting of the court, what threatens social order is not an immediate enemy. Rather, it is Renoir himself who poses the greatest threat to civility as a figure of unrefinement and undeniable excess. The giant is rooted in physicality that is insuperable, and therefore, when his monstrosity is recognized, his full assimilation is an impossibility. Considering they recount the same narrative tale, it remains to be asked why Renoir's assimilation is so different in the 2 chansons. To consider this, we must look outwards to the cultural and religious values of the Anglo-Norman and Old French audiences. One reason may lie in the geographical location of the chanson. Anglo-Norman audiences were removed from the immediate context of the French Moorish conquest, and thus Saracen characters are peripheral to the construction of their identity. The monsters they create would therefore plausibly be romanticized and molded to the requirements of the text, although this is a generalization. Old French audiences would be more conscious of the historic presence of Moorish conflict within their territory. Walker's argument for the recognition of Saracen chivalry in battle is seen in the Old French Renoir. The chanson creates a complex character who reflects the reality of encountering noble chivalric Saracens in battle. It is also intriguing to consider the linguistic difference of the chanson. Anglo-Norman is a language of cultural hybridity and exists, like the giant, in a space delineated by cultural borders, an ideal setting to explore hybrid characters like Renoir. Therefore, it is not surprising that Renoir's assimilation is more conceivable in the Anglo-Norman chanson. The literary context should also be taken into account when considering the differing understandings of Renoir's recuperability. Whereas in Old English literature, giants play a significant role in the construction of English identity, yet in Old French literature, giants exist more frequently as religious others who share the religious practices of the pagan or pseudo-Muslim peoples of the region. Interestingly, considering this literary background, Renoir appears only once in surviving Anglo-Norman literature, yet his story is continued in an abundance of Old French texts after Aliscan. Therefore, the tensions that Aliscan establishes within Renoir's character and setting lay the foundation for future narratives, thus ensuring his literary future. Regardless of the extent of his assimilation, Renoir emerges as a key protagonist at the end of the chanson, arguably overshadowing the titular hero Guillaume. Critics have even argued for the existence of an earlier lost chanson dedicated solely to Renoir that may have later merged with Guillaume's cycle to create Aliscan. The giant appears in multiple later chansons, and his children go on to become great knights who in turn have their own poems. He even appears in Dante's Divine Comedy alongside Charlemagne and Guillaume in Paradise. Renoir's assimilation betrays a continuing fascination with monstrosity, social assimilation, and religious difference, and allows these texts to explore the hybridity of man and monster. Thank you.